The facade of the Villa Medici facing the Piazza della Trinità dei Monti is the only one visible from the street to the general public. This is where one buys one's entrance tickets. Visits are only in guided groups, and one can't wander away from one's group by oneself. Tours are in French, Italian, or English. I had booked a visit with an Italian guide. Despite the spectacular view over Rome from its position on the Collina del Pincio Hill, the villa's most ornate facade is the one facing away from the city. As our guide explained, at the time of its construction in its elaborate present-day state, the idea was to face away from the city with its chaos, noise, and unsanitary conditions. What we see today is mostly the work of Bartolomeo Ammanati, who was commissioned by Cardinal Ferdinando de' Medici in the late 1500s with enlarging and enhancing the existing edifices and gardens. There's a lot of history here, but to get all the details, you want to book a tour of your own when you're next in Rome. One important fact, it was acquired by Napoleon in 1803, remains the seat of the French Academy in Rome to this day, still belongs to France under the supervision of the French Ministry of Culture, and is protected as a cultural monument by both France and Italy. Our group made its way into the justly famous gardens, with me and others lagging behind the guide to film or take photos. On the way to the top of the gardens, we passed the obelisk of the Fountain of the Dolphins, the resident peacock, and Cleopatra's Loggia. At the extreme limit of the gardens, over the Aurelian Wall, is the so-called studiolo, the first room of which is nicknamed the Camera degli Uccelli, the room of the birds. The splendid late 16th century frescoes were only uncovered in 1985 during restoration work. They had presumably been painted over in the early 19th century. Among the multitude of birds in this fresco is a turkey, considered the first representation of a turkey in Europe. Turkeys were previously unknown in Europe, and this image elicited much astonishment among contemporary viewers. Continuing our visit, we arrived at the Gypsoteca, or plaster cast gallery, with its vast array of busts and fragments of friezes. It was also the site of a temporary installation by the Tunisian artist Aisha Snoussi called Tutte Kao, a collection of objects colored vermania, a blue-green from the sea bottom. I found these objects on their tables or in their display cases totally intriguing, and thought their placement in this room was a very appropriate choice of venue for this installation. We continued past this fluted sarcophagus, with water lethargically spouting into it, to one of the most famous areas of the garden. The sculptural group of the Niobids, depicting the myth of Niobe and her children, which I am not going to relate here. These are copies of the originals preserved in the Uffizi in Florence. We returned to the villa. I loved Giambologna's Mercurio Volante, winged Mercury, just outside the loggia, even if this is also a copy of the original, which was carted off to the Uffizi in the 18th century, and later the Bargello in Florence. The same applies to the lions in the loggia. What's here today are copies. The originals are again now in Florence. Passing through the loggia, with its 19th century dedication to Napoleon, we proceeded to the cardinal's apartment above it. Jacopo Zucchi's portrait of Cardinal Ferdinando dei Medici is on the wall of the Camera delle Muse, Chamber of the Muses. The central ceiling panel of Jupiter, Minerva, and Terpsichore is also by Zucchi. The triangle and diamond shapes of the contemporary carpet reference those of the garden rectangles, visible by the obelisk through the window. One room over, in the Camera degli Elementi, Chamber of the Elements, the central ceiling panel depicting the marriage of Jupiter and Juno is also by Jacopo Zucchi. All of the works by him are from the late 16th century. In the final room where our group stopped, The Camera degli Amori, Room of Loves, the original ceiling panels were burned on order of Cosimo de' Medici in the early 18th century. He considered them too lewd. What we see today are 7 panels commissioned by Villa Medici from the contemporary artist Claudio Parmigiani in 2015. They show ephemeral silhouettes of hundreds of butterflies. At the end of the tour, I regrettably had to pass on a visit to the exhibition Le Chant des Sirènes, the Siren Song. It was time to start thinking urgently about getting some lunch.